Welcome to The Explainer. Sometimes a single book comes along that just completely flips how we think about a major historical event. And today, we are diving into one of those.
And it's about a huge question. How did Islam begin? Now, for most of us, there's a pretty standard story we've all heard.
Yeah, that story. You know the one, a sudden, dramatic revelation happening in what feels like a historical vacuum, out there in the isolated deserts of Arabia?
But what if that's not the whole picture? What if that powerful beginning was actually an ending? Well, that is the really provocative idea in Aziz al-Azma's book. He wants us to zoom way, way out and see that Arabia wasn't some isolated stage. No, it was part of a much bigger, interconnected world. And he makes this really critical point right up front. He's not just talking about Islam and late antiquity as if they're two separate things. Now, the key word, and this is so important, is in. It's about Islam in late antiquity. See the difference? It's not about connecting two things. It's about seeing one thing being born, completely inside the other. Islam is a product of its time. That one little word in, well, it changes absolutely everything. All right, so here's our game plan for breaking this down. First, we're going to rethink the whole origin story. Then we'll look at the world Islam was born into. We'll find Arabia's place in that world, see this new idea of a point of arrival, and finally talk about why all of this really matters. Okay, first up, rethinking the origins. We're going to shift from seeing this story as something that came out of nowhere to something that was, well, the culmination of everything. So here's the big idea. Al-Azma says, look, the emergence of Islam wasn't some unique event that breaks the rules of history. Instead, he calls it the most successful crystallization of all these ideas, religious, political, you name it, that were already swirling around the region. It wasn't the start of something from scratch. It was more like the moment all these ingredients that had been simmering for centuries finally came together. Okay, so to really get what he means by crystallization, we have to get a feel for the world it happened in. And that world is called late antiquity. Now, you might have heard of this as a time of decline, the fall of Rome and all that. But that's not the full story. It was an incredibly dynamic, transformative time. The old Roman world was changing, for sure, but all these huge new ideas about a single god and what it means to have an empire were just reshaping everything, all the way from Britain to Persia. So what was this world like? Well, a few big things were going on. You had these giant ecumenical empires, that's just a fancy word for universal, that wanted to rule the whole known world. You also had this massive shift away from worshiping many gods to worshiping just one. And a huge piece of the puzzle, the Roman Empire's center of power wasn't really in Rome anymore. It had shifted east to cities like Constantinople. And to help us picture this whole thing, Al-Azma uses this fantastic analogy, an hourglass. Think about it. You start wide at the top. That's the big empires, Rome and Persia. Then the sand funnels down into that narrow middle part. That's our focus, West Arabia. And then, whoosh, it widens out again at the bottom. That's the explosion of the new Paleo-Muslim Empire, which itself becomes a huge player on the world stage. So let's zoom in on that narrow neck of the hourglass, Arabia. Now, the old story would have you believe it was totally isolated, right? Cut off from everything. But this book says, nope, not at all. The key idea here is that Arabia wasn't a tabula rasa, a blank slate. It wasn't some forgotten corner of the world. It was a player, woven right into the fabric of everything that was going on, even if it was kind of on the edges of the big empires. And the evidence for this is everywhere, Arab tribes were fighting as allies for the big empires. The trade routes weren't just for goods, they were like information highways. And really importantly, the idea of one god was already floating around. Al-Azma has this great phrase for it, ambient monotheism. It was just in the air. So no, Arabia was not cut off. It was plugged in. Okay, so if Arabia was already part of this whole scene, then what are we to make of what happened in the 7th century, right? This is where we get to the real heart of the argument. To really focus in on this early time, Al-Azma comes up with a new term, Paleo-Islam. And the reason he does this is really smart. It helps us look at that foundational period on its own terms, without all the baggage of centuries of later history and theology. It's about seeing it for what it was, right then and there. And this is the punchline, really. The emergence of this new monotheism, this new community in Arabia, it wasn't a beginning out of nowhere. It was a point of arrival. It was the finish line for all these trends that had been developing for ages all over the Near East. Okay, so that's the argument, but you might be thinking, so what? Why does this matter? It's a fair question. Why is this academic reframing so important?
Well, think about it like this. The old view tells a story that's totally unique, almost outside of history. That makes it hard to compare to anything else. But Al-Ozma's view says, no, this was a product of its time. It's a historical process we can actually recognize, something we can compare to the rise of other great religions and empires.
And what that does, ultimately, is it makes the history of Islam, as the author puts it, less alien and self-enclosed. It's not this separate, walled-off story anymore. It's part of our shared human history, a really powerful and game-changing chapter in that story of late antiquity.
So, that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. This whole book shows how just changing your frame, just zooming out a bit, can totally transform how you see the past. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other huge parts of history might look completely different if we just tried looking at them from a new angle?